Part II, Chapter 15 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne, Chapter 15. The Last Exploring Expedition. From this date, February 3rd, the sun rose each day higher above the horizon. The nights were, however, still very long, and, as is often the case in February, the cold increased, the thermometer marking only 1° Fahrenheit, the lowest temperature experienced throughout this extraordinary winter. "When does the thaw commence in these northern seas?" inquired Mrs Barnett of the Lieutenant. "In ordinary seasons," replied Hobson, "the ice does not break up until early in May. But the winter has been so mild that unless a very hard frost should now set in, the thaw may commence at the beginning of April. At least that is my opinion." "We shall still have 2 months to wait, then?" "Yes, 2 months, for it would not be prudent to launch our boat too soon amongst the floating ice. I think our best plan will be to wait until our island has reached the narrowest part of Behring Strait, which is not more than 200 miles wide." "What do you mean?" exclaimed Mrs Barnett, considerably surprised at the Lieutenant's reply. "Have you forgotten that it was the Kamtchatka Current which brought us where we are now, and which may seize us again when the thaw sets in, and carry us yet farther north?" "I do not think it will, madam. Indeed, I feel quite sure that it will not happen. The thaw always takes place in from north to south, and although the Kamtchatka Current runs the other way, the ice will go down the Behring Current. Other reasons there are for my opinion which I cannot now enumerate, but the icebergs invariably drift towards the Pacific, and are there melted by its warmer waters. Ask Kalumah if I am not right. She knows these latitudes well, and will tell you that the thaw always proceeds from the north to the south." Kalumah, when questioned, confirmed all that the Lieutenant had said, so that it appeared probable that the island would be drifted to the south like a huge ice floe, that is to say, to the narrowest part of Behring Strait, which is much more frequented in the summer by the fishermen of New Archangel, who are the most experienced mariners of those waters. Making allowance for all delays, they might then hope to set foot on the continent before May, and although the cold had not been very intense, there was every reason to believe that the foundations of Victoria Island had been thickened and strengthened by a fresh accumulation of ice at the base, and that it would hold together for several months to come. There was nothing for the colonists to do but to wait patiently, still to wait. The convalescence of little Michael continued to progress favourably. On the 20th of February he went out for the first time, 40 days after he was taken ill. By this we mean that he went from his bedroom into the large room, where he was petted and made much of. His mother, acting by Madge's advice, put off weaning him for some little time, and he soon got back his strength. The soldiers had made many little toys for him during his illness, and he was now as happy as any child in the wide world. The last week of February was very wet, rain and snow falling alternately. A strong wind blew from the north west, and the temperature was low enough for large quantities of snow to fall. The gale, however, increased in violence, and on the side of Cape Bathurst and the chain of icebergs the noise of the tempest was deafening. The huge ice masses were flung against each other, and fell with a roar like that of thunder. The ice on the north was compressed and piled up on the shores of the island. There really seemed to be a danger that the cape itself, which was but a kind of iceberg capped with earth and sand, would be flung down. Some large pieces of ice, in spite of their weight, were driven to the very foot of the palisaded enceinte, but fortunately for the factory, the cape retained its position. Had it given way, all the buildings must inevitably have been crushed beneath it. It will be easily understood that the position of Victoria Island at the opening of a narrow strait, about which the ice accumulated in large quantities, was extremely perilous, for it might at any time be swept by a horizontal avalanche, or crushed beneath the huge blocks of ice driven inland from the offing, and so become engulfed before the thaw. This was a new danger to be added to all the others already threatening the little band. Mrs Barnett, seeing the awful power of the pressure in the offing, and the violence with which the moving masses of ice crushed upon each other, realised the full magnitude of the peril they would all be in when the thaw commenced. She often mentioned her fears to the Lieutenant, and he shook his head like a man who had no reply to make. Early in March the squall ceased, and the full extent of the transformation of the ice field was revealed. It seemed as if by a kind of glissade the chain of icebergs had drawn nearer to the island. In some parts it was not 2 miles distant, and it advanced like a glacier on the move, with the difference that the latter has a descending and the ice wall a horizontal motion. Between the lofty chain of ice mountains the ice field was fearfully distorted, strewn with hummocks, broken obelisks, shattered blocks, overturned pyramids. It resembled a tempest-tossed sea or a ruined town, in which not a building or a monument had remained standing. And above it all the mighty icebergs reared their snowy crests, standing out against the sky with their pointed peaks, their rugged cones, and solid buttresses, forming a fitting frame for the weird fantastic landscape at their feet. At this date the little vessel was quite finished. This boat was rather heavy in shape, as might be expected, but she did credit to Mac Nab, and shaped as she was, like a barge at the bows, she ought the better to withstand the shocks of the floating ice. She might have been taken for one of those Dutch boats which venture upon the northern waters. Her rig, which was completed, consisted, like that of a cutter, of a mainsail and a jib carried on a single mast. The tent canvas of the factory had been made use of for sailcloth. This boat would carry the whole colony, and if, as the Lieutenant hoped, the island were drifted to Behring Strait, the vessel would easily make her way to land, even from the widest part of the passage. There was then nothing to be done but wait for the thaw. Hobson now decided to make a long excursion to the south to ascertain the state of the ice field, to see whether there were any signs of it breaking up, to examine the chain of icebergs by which it was hemmed in, to make sure, in short, whether it would be really useless to attempt to cross to the American continent. Many incidents might occur, many fresh dangers might arise before the thaw, and it would therefore be but prudent to make a reconnaissance on the ice field. The expedition was organised, and the start fixed for March 7th. Hobson, Mrs Barnett, Kalumah, Marbre, and Sabine were to go, and if the route should be practicable, they would try and find a passage across the chain of icebergs. In any case, however, they were not to be absent for more than 48 hours. A good stock of provisions was prepared, and, well provided for every contingency, the little party left Fort Hope on the morning of the 7th March, and turned towards Cape Michael. The thermometer then marked 32° Fahrenheit. The atmosphere was misty, but the weather was perfectly calm. The sun was now above the horizon for 7 or 8 hours a day, and its oblique rays afforded plenty of light. At 9 o'clock, after a short halt, the party descended the slope of Cape Michael, and made their way across the ice fields in a south-easterly direction. On this side the ice wall rose not 3 miles from the cape. The march was of course very slow. Every minute a crevasse had to be turned, or a hummock too high to be climbed. It was evident that a sledge could not have got over the rough distorted surface, which consisted of an accumulation of blocks of ice of every shape and size, some of which really seemed to retain their equilibrium by a miracle. Others had been but recently overturned, as could be seen from the clearly cut fractures and sharp corners. Not a sign was to be seen of any living creature. No footprints told of the passage of man or beast, and the very birds had deserted these awful solitudes. Mrs Barnett was astonished at the scene before her, and asked the Lieutenant how they could possibly have crossed the ice fields if they had started in December, and he replied by reminding her that it was then in a very different condition. The enormous pressure of the advancing icebergs had not then commenced, the surface of the sea was comparatively even, and the only danger was from its insufficient solidification. The irregularities which now barred their passage did not exist early in the winter. They managed, however, to advance towards the mighty ice wall, Kalumah generally leading the way. Like a chamois on the Alpine rocks, the girl firmly treaded the ice masses, with a swiftness of foot and an absence of hesitation which was really marvellous. She knew by instinct the best way through the labyrinths of icebergs, and was an unerring guide to her companions. About noon the base of the ice wall was reached, but it had taken 3 hours to get over 3 miles. The icy barrier presented a truly imposing appearance, rising as it did more than 400 feet above the ice field. The various strata of which it was formed were clearly defined, and the glistening surface was tinged with many a delicately shaded hue. Jasper like ribbons of green and blue alternated with streaks and dashes of all the colours of the rainbow, strewn with enamelled arabesques, sparkling crystals, and delicate ice flowers. No cliff, however strangely distorted, could give any idea of this marvellous half opaque, half transparent ice wall, and no description could do justice to the wonderful effects of chiaro oscuro produced upon it. It would not do, however, to approach too near to these beetling cliffs, the solidity of which was very doubtful. Internal fractures and rents were already commencing. The work of destruction and decomposition was proceeding rapidly, aided by the imprisoned air bubbles, and the fragility of the huge structure, built up by the cold, was manifest to every eye. It could not survive the Arctic winter, it was doomed to melt beneath the sunbeams, and it contained material enough to feed large rivers. Lieutenant Hobson had warned his companions of the danger of the avalanches which constantly fall from the summits of the icebergs, and they did not therefore go far along their base. That this prudence was necessary was proved by the falling of a huge block at 2 o'clock at the entrance to a kind of valley which they were about to cross. It must have weighed more than 100 tons, and it was dashed upon the ice field with a fearful crash, bursting like a bombshell. Fortunately no one was hurt by the splinters. From 2 to 5 o'clock the explorers followed a narrow winding path leading down amongst the icebergs. They were anxious to know if it led right through them, but could not at once ascertain. In this valley, as it might be called, they were able to examine the internal structure of the icy barrier. The blocks of which it was built up were here arranged with greater symmetry than outside. In some places trunks of trees were seen embedded in the ice, all, however, of tropical, not polar species, which had evidently been brought to Arctic regions by the Gulf Stream, and would be taken back to the ocean when the thaw should have converted into water the ice which now held them in its chill embrace. At 5 o'clock it became too dark to go any further. The travellers had not gone more than about 2 miles in the valley, but it was so sinuous that it was impossible to estimate exactly the distance traversed. The signal to halt was given by the Lieutenant, and Marbre and Sabine quickly dug out a grotto in the ice with their chisels, into which the whole party crept, and after a good supper all were soon asleep. Every one was up at 8 o'clock the next morning, and Hobson decided to follow the valley for another mile, in the hope of finding out whether it went right through the ice wall. The direction of the pass, judging from the position of the sun, had now changed from north to southeast, and as early as 11 o'clock the party came out on the opposite side of the chain of icebergs. The passage was therefore proved to run completely through the barrier. The aspect of the ice field on the eastern side was exactly similar to that on the west. The same confusion of ice masses, the same accumulation of hummocks and icebergs, as far as the eye could reach, with occasional alternations of smooth surfaces of small extent, intersected by numerous crevices, the edges of which were already melting fast. The same complete solitude, the same desertion, not a bird, not an animal to be seen. Mrs Barnett climbed to the top of the hummock, and there remained for an hour, gazing upon the sad and desolate Polar landscape before her. Her thoughts involuntarily flew back to the miserable attempt to escape that had been made 5 months before. Once more she saw the men and women of the hapless caravan encamped in the darkness of these frozen solitudes, or struggling against the insurmountable difficulties to reach the mainland. At last the Lieutenant broke in upon her reverie, and said— "Madam, it is more than 24 hours since we left the fort. We know the thickness of the ice wall, and as we promised not to be away longer than 48 hours, I think it is time to retrace our steps." Mrs Barnett saw the justice of the Lieutenant's remark. They had ascertained the barrier of ice was of moderate thickness, that it would melt away quickly enough to allow of the passage of Mac Nab's boat after the thaw, and it would therefore be well to hasten back lest a snowstorm or change in the weather of any kind should render return through the winding valley difficult. The party breakfasted and set out on the return journey about 1 o'clock p.m. The night was passed as before in an ice cavern, and the route resumed at 8 o'clock the next morning, March 9th. The travellers now turned their backs upon the sun, as they were making for the west, but the weather was fine, and the orb of day, already high in the heavens, flung some of its rays across the valley, and lit up the glittering ice walls on either side. Mrs Barnett and Kalumah were a little behind the rest of the party, chatting together, and looking about them as they wound through the narrow passages pointed out by Marbre and Sabine. They expected to get out of the valley quickly, and be back at the fort before sunset, as they had only 2 or 3 miles of the island to cross after leaving the ice. This would be a few hours after the time fixed, but not long enough to cause any serious anxiety to their friends at home. They made their calculation without allowing for an incident which no human perspicacity could possibly have foreseen. It was about 10 o'clock when Marbre and Sabine, who were some 20 paces in advance of the rest, suddenly stopped and appeared to be debating some point. When the others came up, Sabine was holding out his compass to Marbre, who was staring at it with an expression of the utmost astonishment. "What an extraordinary thing!" he exclaimed, and added, turning to the Lieutenant— "Will you tell me, sir, the position of the island with regard to the ice wall? Is it on the east or west?" "On the west," replied Hobson, not a little surprised at the question. "You know that well enough, Marbre." "I know it well enough, I know it well enough," repeated Marbre, shaking his head; "and if it is on the west, we are going wrong, away from the island." "What! Away from the island?" exclaimed the Lieutenant, struck with the hunter's air of conviction. "We are indeed, sir," said Marbre. "Look at the compass. My name is not Marbre if it does not show that we are walking towards the east, not the west." "Impossible!" exclaimed Mrs Barnett. "Look, madam," said Sabine. It was true, the needle pointed in exactly the opposite direction to that expected. Hobson looked thoughtful and said nothing. "We must have made a mistake when we left the ice cavern this morning," observed Sabine. "We ought to have turned to the left instead of to the right." "No, no," said Mrs Barnett, "I am sure we did not make a mistake." "But—" said Marbre. "But," interrupted Mrs Barnett, "look at the sun. Does it no longer rise in the east? Now, as we turned our backs on it this morning, and it is still behind us, we must be walking towards the west, so that when we get out of the valley, on the western side of the chain of icebergs, we must come to the island we left there." Marbre, struck dumb by this irrefutable argument, crossed his arms and said no more. "Then if so," said Sabine, "the sun and the compass are in complete contradiction of each other." "At this moment they are," said Hobson, "and the reason is simple enough. In these high northern latitudes, and in latitudes in the neighbourhood of the magnetic pole, the compasses are sometimes disturbed, and the deviation of their needle is so great as to entirely mislead travellers." "All right, then," said Marbre, "we have only to go on keeping our backs to the sun." "Certainly," replied Lieutenant Hobson. "There can be no hesitation which to choose, the sun or our compass. Nothing disturbs the sun." The march was resumed. The sun was still behind them, and there was really no objection to be made to Hobson's theory, founded as it was upon the position then occupied by the radiant orb of day. The little troop marched on, but they did not get out of the valley as soon as they expected. Hobson had counted on leaving the ice wall before noon, and it was past 2 when they reached the opening of the narrow pass. Strange as was this delay, it had not made any one uneasy, and the astonishment of all can readily be imagined when, on stepping on to the ice field at the base of the chain of icebergs, no sign was to be seen of Victoria Island, which ought to have been opposite to them. Yes, the island which on this side had been such a conspicuous object, owing to the height of Cape Michael crowned with trees, had disappeared. In its place stretched a vast ice field lit up by the sunbeams. All looked around them, and then at each other in amazement. "The island ought to be there!" cried Sabine. "But it is not there," said Marbre. "Oh, sir Lieutenant, where is it? What has become of it?" But Hobson had not a word to say in reply, and Mrs Barnett was equally dumbfounded. Kalumah now approached Lieutenant Hobson, and touching his arm, she said— "We went wrong in the valley. We went up it instead of down it. We shall only get back to where we were yesterday by crossing the chain of icebergs. Come, come!" Hobson and the others mechanically followed Kalumah, and trusting in the young native's sagacity, retraced their steps. Appearances were, however, certainly against her, for they were now walking towards the sun in an easterly direction. Kalumah did not explain her motives, but muttered as she went along— "Let us make haste." All were quite exhausted, and could scarcely get along, when they found themselves on the other side of the ice wall, after a walk of 3 hours. The night had now fallen, and it was too dark to see if the island was there, but they were not long left in doubt. At about 100 paces off, burning torches were moving about, whilst reports of guns and shouts were heard. The explorers replied, and were soon joined by Sergeant Long and others, amongst them Thomas Black, whose anxiety as to the fate of his friends had at last roused him from his torpor. The poor fellows left on the island had been in a terrible state of uneasiness, thinking that Hobson and his party had lost their way. They were right, but what was it that had made them think so? 24 hours before, the immense ice field and the island had turned half round, and in consequence of this displacement they were no longer on the west but on the east side of the ice wall. Chapter 15. Part II, Chapter 16 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 16. The Break-up of the Ice. 2 hours later all had returned to Fort Hope, and the next day the sun for the first time shone upon that part of the coast which was formerly on the west of the island. Kalumah, to whom this phenomenon was familiar, had been right, and if the sun had not been the guilty party, neither had the compass. The position of Victoria Island with regard to the cardinal points was again completely changed, since it had broken loose from the mainland, and not only the island, but the vast ice field in which it was enclosed, had turned half around. This displacement proved that the ice field was not connected with the continent, and that the thaw would soon set in. "Well, Lieutenant," said Mrs Barnett, "this change of front is certainly in our favour. Cape Bathurst and Fort Hope are now turned towards the northeast, in other words, towards the point nearest to the continent, and the ice wall, through which our boat could only have made its way by a difficult and dangerous passage, is no longer between us and America, and so all is for the best, is it not?" added Mrs Barnett with a smile. "Indeed it is," replied Hobson, who fully realised all that was involved in this change of the position of Victoria Island. No incident occurred between the 10th and 21st March, but there were indications of the approaching change of the season. The temperature varied from 43 to 50° Fahrenheit, and it appeared likely that the breaking up of the ice would commence suddenly. Fresh crevasses opened, and the unfrozen water flooded the surface of the ice. As the whalers poetically express it, the wounds of the ice field bled copiously, and the opening of these wounds was accompanied by a sound like the roar of artillery. A warm rain fell for several hours, and accelerated the dissolution of the solid coating of the ocean. The birds, ptarmigans, puffins, ducks, &c., which had deserted the island in the beginning of winter, now returned in large numbers. Marbre and Sabine killed a few of them, and on some were found the tickets tied round their necks by the Lieutenant several months before. Flocks of white trumpeter swans also reappeared, and filled the air with their loud clarion tones, whilst the quadrupeds, rodents, and carnivora alike continued to frequent the vicinity of the fort like tame domestic animals. Whenever the state of the sky permitted, which was almost every day, Hobson took the altitude of the sun. Sometimes Mrs Barnett, who had become quite expert in handling the sextant, assisted him, or took the observations in his stead. It was now most important to note the very slightest changes in the latitude and longitude of the island. It was still doubtful to which current it would be subject after the thaw, and the question whether it would be drifted north or south was the chief subject of the discussions between the Lieutenant and Mrs Barnett. The brave lady had always given proof of an energy superior to that of most of her sex, and now she was to be seen every day braving fatigue and venturing on to the half decomposed or pancake ice in all weathers, through snow or rain, and on her return to the factory ready to cheer and help everybody, and to superintend all that was going on. We must add that her efforts were ably seconded by the faithful Madge. Mrs Barnett had compelled herself to look the future firmly in the face, and although she could not fail to fear for the safety of all, and sad presentiments haunted her, she never allowed herself to betray any uneasiness. Her courage and confidence never seemed to waver. She was as ever the kind encouraging friend of each and all, and none could have dreamt of the conflict of spirit going on beneath her quiet exterior demeanour. Lieutenant Hobson's admiration of her character was unbounded, and he had also entire confidence in Kalumah, often trusting to her natural instinct as implicitly as a hunter to that of his dog. The young Esquimaux was in fact very intelligent, and familiar from babyhood with the phenomena of the Polar regions. On board a whaler she might have advantageously replaced many an ice master or pilot whose business it is to guide a boat amongst the ice. Every day Kalumah went to examine the state of the ice field. The nature of the noise produced by the breaking of the icebergs in the distance was enough to tell her how far the decomposition had advanced. No foot was surer than hers upon the ice. No one could spring more lightly forwards than she when her instinct told her that the smooth surface was rotten underneath, and she would scud across an ice field riddled with fissures without a moment's hesitation. From the 20th to the 30th March the thaw made rapid progress. Rain fell abundantly and accelerated the dissolution of the ice. It was to be hoped that the ice field would soon open right across, and that in about 15 days Hobson would be able to steer his boat into the open sea. He was determined to lose no time, as he did not know but that the Kamtchatka Current might sweep the island to the north before it could come under the influence of the Behring Current. "But," Kalumah repeated again and again, "there is no fear of that, for the breaking up of the ice does not proceed upwards but downwards. The danger is there," she added, pointing to the south in the direction of the vast Pacific Ocean. The young girl's confidence on this point reassured Hobson, for he had no reason now to dread the falling to pieces of the island in the warm waters of the Pacific. He meant everybody to be on board the boat before that could happen, and they would not have far to go to get to one or the other continent, as the strait is in reality a kind of funnel through which the waters flow between Cape East on the Asiatic side and Cape Prince of Wales on the American. This will explain the eager attention with which the slightest change in the position of the island was noticed. The bearings were taken every day, and everything was prepared for an approaching and perhaps sudden and hurried embarkation. Of course all the ordinary avocations of the factory were now discontinued. There was no hunting or setting of traps. The magazines were already piled with furs, most of which would be lost. The hunters and trappers had literally nothing to do, but Mac Nab and his men, having finished their boat, employed their leisure time in strengthening the principal house of the fort, which would probably be subjected to considerable pressure from the accumulation of ice on the coast during the further progress of the thaw, unless indeed Cape Bathurst should prove a sufficient protection. Strong struts were fixed against the outside walls, vertical props were placed inside the rooms to afford additional support to the beams of the ceiling, and the roof was strengthened so that it could bear a considerable weight. These various works were completed early in April, and their utility, or rather their vital importance, was very soon manifested. Each day brought fresh symptoms of returning spring, which seemed likely to set in early after this strangely mild polar winter. A few tender shoots appeared upon the trees, and the newly thawed sap swelled the bark of beeches, willows, and arbutus. Tiny mosses tinged with pale green the slopes under the direct influence of the sunbeams, but they were not likely to spread much, as the greedy rodents collected about the fort pounced upon them and devoured them almost before they were above the ground. Great were the sufferings of Corporal Joliffe at this time. We know that he had undertaken to protect the plot of ground cultivated by his wife. Under ordinary circumstances he would merely have had to drive away feathered pilferers, such as guillemots or puffins, from his sorrel and scurvy grass. A scarecrow would have been enough to get rid of them, still more the Corporal in person. But now all the rodents and ruminants of the Arctic fauna combined to lay siege to his territory. Reindeer, polar hares, muskrats, shrews, martens, etc., braved all the threatening gestures of the Corporal, and the poor man was in despair, for whilst he was defending one end of his field, the enemy was preying upon the other. It would certainly have been wiser to let the poor creatures enjoy unmolested the crops which could be of no use to the colonists, as the fort was to be so soon abandoned, and Mrs Barnett tried to persuade the angry Corporal to do so, when he came to her 20 times a day with the same wearisome tale, but he would not listen to her. "To lose the fruit of all our trouble," he repeated, "to leave an establishment which was prospering so well, to give up the plants Mrs Joliffe and I sowed so carefully. Oh, madam, sometimes I feel disposed to let you all go and stay here with my wife. I am sure the Company would give up all claim on the island to us." Mrs Barnett could not help laughing at this absurd speech, and sent the Corporal to his little wife, who had long ago resigned herself to the loss of her sorrel, scurvy grass, and other medicinal herbs. We must here remark that the health of all the colonists remained good. They had at least escaped illness. The baby, too, was now quite well again, and throve admirably in the mild weather of the early spring. The thaw continued to proceed rapidly from the 2nd to the 5th April. The weather was warm but cloudy, and rain fell frequently in large drops. The wind blew from the south-west, and was laden with the heated dust of the continent. Unfortunately the sky was so hazy that it was quite impossible to take observations. Neither sun, moon, nor stars could be seen through the heavy mists, and this was the more provoking, as it was of the greatest importance to note the slightest movements of the island. It was on the night of the 7th April that the actual breaking up of the ice commenced. In the morning the Lieutenant, Mrs Barnett, Kalumah, and Sergeant Long had climbed to the summit of Cape Bathurst, and saw that a great change had taken place in the chain of icebergs. The huge barrier had parted nearly in the middle, and now formed two separate masses, the larger of which seemed to be moving northwards in the chain of icebergs. Was it the Kamtchatka Current which produced this motion? Would the floating island take the same direction? The intense anxiety of the Lieutenant and his companions can easily be imagined. Their fate might now be decided in a few hours, and if they should be drifted some 100 miles to the north, it would be very difficult to reach the continent in a vessel so small as theirs. Unfortunately, it was impossible to ascertain the nature or extent of the displacement which was going on. One thing was, however, evident: the island was not yet moving, at least not in the same direction as the ice wall. It therefore seemed probable that whilst part of the ice field was floating to the north, that portion immediately surrounding the island still remained stationary. This displacement of the icebergs did not in the least alter the opinion of the young Esquimaux. Kalumah still maintained that the thaw would proceed from north to south, and that the ice wall would shortly feel the influence of the Behring Current. To make herself more easily understood, she traced the direction of the current on the sand with a little piece of wood, and made signs that in following it the island must approach the American continent. No argument could shake her conviction on this point, and it was almost impossible not to feel reassured when listening to the confident expressions of the intelligent native girl. The events of the 8th, 9th, and 10th April seemed, however, to prove Kalumah to be in the wrong. The northern portion of the chain of icebergs drifted further and further north. The breaking up of the ice proceeded rapidly and with a great noise, and the ice field opened all round the island with a deafening crash. Out of doors it was impossible to hear one's self speak. A ceaseless roar like that of artillery drowned every other sound. About half a mile from the coast, on that part of the island overlooked by Cape Bathurst, the blocks of ice were already beginning to crowd together and to pile themselves upon each other. The ice wall had broken up into numerous separate icebergs, which were drifting towards the north. At least it seemed as if they were moving in that direction. Hobson became more and more uneasy, and nothing that Kalumah could say reassured him. He replied by counter arguments, which could not shake her faith in her own belief. At last, on the morning of the 11th April, Hobson showed Kalumah the last icebergs disappearing in the north, and again endeavoured to prove to her that facts were against her. "No, no," replied Kalumah with an air of greater conviction than ever. "No, the icebergs are not going to the north, but our island is going to the south." She might perhaps be right after all, and Hobson was much struck by this last reply. It was really possible that the motion of the icebergs towards the north was only apparent, and that Victoria Island, dragged along with the ice field, was drifting towards the strait. But it was impossible to ascertain whether this were really the case, as neither the latitude nor longitude could be taken. The situation was aggravated by a phenomenon peculiar to the Polar regions, which rendered it still darker and more impossible to take observations of any kind. At the very time of the breaking up of ice, the temperature fell several degrees. A dense mist presently enveloped the Arctic latitudes, but not an ordinary mist. The soil was covered with a white crust, totally distinct from hoar-frost. It was, in fact, a watery vapour which congeals on its precipitation. The minute particles of which this mist was composed formed a thick layer on trees, shrubs, the walls of the fort, and any projecting surface which bristled with pyramidal or prismatic crystals, the apexes of which pointed to the wind. Hobson at once understood the nature of this atmospheric phenomenon, which whalers and explorers have often noticed in the spring in the Polar regions. "It is not a mist or fog," he said to his companions. It is a frost rime, a dense vapour which remains in a state of complete congelation. But whether a fog or a frozen mist, this phenomenon was none the less to be regretted, for it rose 100 feet at least above the level of the sea, and it was so opaque that the colonists could not see each other when only 2 or 3 paces apart. Every one's disappointment was very great. Nature really seemed determined to try them to the uttermost. When the break up of the ice had come at last, when the wandering island was to leave the spot in which it had so long been imprisoned, and its movements ought to be watched with the greatest care, this fog prevented all observations. This state of things continued for 4 days. The frost rime did not disappear until the 15th April, but on the morning of that date a strong wind from the south rent it open and dispersed it. The sun shone brightly once more, and Hobson eagerly seized his instruments. He took the altitude, and found that the exact position of Victoria Island was then latitude 69° 57', longitude 179° 33'. Kalumah was right. Victoria Island, in the grasp of the Behring Current, was drifting towards the south. CHAPTER 17. Of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 17. The Avalanche. The colonists were then at last approaching the more frequented latitudes of Behring Sea. There was no longer any danger that they would be drifted to the north, and all they had to do was to watch the displacement of the island, and to estimate the speed of its motion, which would probably be very unequal on account of the obstacles in its path. Hobson most carefully noted every incident, taking alternately solar and stellar altitudes, and the next day, April 16th, after ascertaining the bearings, he calculated that if its present speed were maintained, Victoria Island would reach the Arctic Circle, from which it was now separated at the most by 4° of latitude, towards the beginning of May. It was probable that, when the island reached the narrowest portion of the strait, it would remain stationary until the thaw broke it up. The boat would then be launched, and the colonists would set sail for the American continent. Everything was ready for an immediate embarkation, and the inhabitants of the island waited with greater patience and confidence than ever. They felt, poor things, that the end of their trials was surely near at last, and that nothing could prevent their landing on one side or the other of the strait in a few days. This prospect cheered them up wonderfully, and the gaiety natural to them all, which they had lost in the terrible anxiety they had so long endured, was restored. The common meals were quite festal, as there was no need for economizing the stores under present circumstances. The influence of the spring became more and more sensibly felt, and every one enjoyed the balmy air, and breathed more freely than before. During the next few days several excursions were made to the interior of the island and along the coast. Everywhere the furred animals, etc., still abounded, for even now they could not cross to the continent, the connection between it and the ice field being broken, and their continued presence was a fresh proof that the island was no longer stationary. No change had taken place on the island at Cape Esquimaux, Cape Michael, along the coast, or on the wooded heights of the interior, and the banks of the lagoon. The large gulf which had opened near Cape Michael during the storm had closed in the winter, and there was no other fissure on the surface of the soil. During these excursions bands of wolves were seen scudding across parts of the island. Of all the animals, these fierce carnivorous beasts were the only ones which the feeling of a common danger had not tamed. Kalumah's preserver was seen several times. This worthy bear paced to and fro on the deserted plains in melancholy mood, pausing in his walks as the explorers passed, and sometimes following them to the fort, knowing well that he had nothing to fear from them. On the 20th April, Lieutenant Hobson ascertained that the wandering island was still drifting to the south. All that remained of the ice wall, that is to say, the southern portion of the icebergs, followed it, but as there were no bench marks, the changes of position could only be estimated by astronomical observations. Hobson took several soundings in different parts of the ground, especially at the foot of Cape Bathurst and on the shores of the lagoon. He was anxious to ascertain the thickness of the layer of ice supporting the earth and sand, and found that it had not increased during the winter, and that the general level of the island did not appear to have risen higher above that of the sea. The conclusion he drew from these facts was, that no time should be lost in getting away from the fragile island, which would rapidly break up and dissolve in the warmer waters of the Pacific. About the 25th April the bearing of the island was again changed. The whole ice field had moved round from east to west 12 points, so that Cape Bathurst pointed to the north-west. The remains of the ice wall now shut in the northern horizon, so that there could be no doubt that the ice field was moving freely in the strait, and that it nowhere touched any land. The fatal moment was approaching. Diurnal or nocturnal observations gave the exact position of the island, and consequently of the ice field. On the 30th of April both were together drifting across Kotzebue Sound, a large triangular gulf running some distance inland on the American coast, and bounded on the south by Cape Prince of Wales, which might perhaps arrest the course of the island if it should deviate in the very least from the middle of the narrow pass. The weather was now pretty fine, and the column of mercury often marked 50° Fahrenheit. The colonists had left off their winter garments some weeks before, and held themselves in constant readiness to leave the island. Thomas Black had already transported his instruments and books to the boat, which was waiting on the beach. A good many provisions had also been embarked, and some of the most valuable furs. On the 2nd of May a very carefully taken observation showed that Victoria Island had a tendency to drift towards the east, and consequently to reach the American continent. This was fortunate, as they were now out of danger of being taken any further by the Kamtchatka Current, which, as is well known, runs along the coast of Asia. At last the tide was turning in favour of the colonists. "I think our bad fortune is at last at an end," observed Sergeant Long to Mrs Barnett, "and that our misfortunes are really over. I don't suppose there are any more dangers to be feared now." "I quite agree with you," replied Mrs Barnett, "and it is very fortunate that we had to give up our journey across the ice field a few months ago. We ought to be very thankful that it was impassable." Mrs Barnett was certainly justified in speaking as she did, for what fearful fatigues and sufferings they would all have had to undergo in crossing 500 miles of ice in the darkness of the Polar night. On the 5th May Hobson announced that Victoria Island had just crossed the Arctic Circle. It had at last re-entered that zone of the terrestrial sphere in which at one period of the year the sun does not set. The poor people all felt that they were returning to the inhabited globe. The event of crossing the Arctic Circle was celebrated in much the same way as crossing the equator for the first time would be on board ship, and many glasses of spirits was drank in honour of the event. There was now nothing left to do but to wait till the broken and half-melted ice should allow of the passage of the boat, which was to bear the whole colony to the land. During the 7th May the island turned round to the extent of another quarter of its circumference. Cape Bathurst now pointed due north, and those masses of the old chain of icebergs which still remained standing were now above it, so that it occupied much the same position as that assigned to it in maps when it was united to the American continent. The island gradually turned completely round, and the sun had risen successively on every point of its shores. The observations of the 8th May showed that the island had become stationary near the middle of the passage, at least 40 miles from Cape Prince of Wales, so that land was now at a comparatively short distance from it, and the safety of all seemed to be secured. In the evening a good supper was served in the large room, and the healths of Mrs Barnett and of Lieutenant Hobson were proposed. The same night the Lieutenant determined to go and see if any changes had taken place in the ice field on the south, hoping that a practicable passage might have been opened. Mrs Barnett was anxious to accompany him, but he persuaded her to rest a little instead, and started off, accompanied only by Sergeant Long. Mrs Barnett, Madge, and Kalumah returned to the principal house after seeing them off, and the soldiers and women had already gone to bed in the different apartments assigned to them. It was a fine night. There was no moon, but the stars shone very brightly, and as the ice field vividly reflected their light, it was possible to see for a considerable distance. It was 9 o'clock when the two explorers left the fort and turned towards that part of the coast between Port Barnett and Cape Michael. They followed the beach for about 2 miles, and found the ice field in a state of positive chaos. The sea was one vast aggregation of crystals of every size. It looked as if it had been petrified suddenly when tossing in a tempest, and alas, there was even now no free passage between the ice masses. It would be impossible for a boat to pass yet. Hobson and Long remained on the ice field, talking and looking about them until midnight, and then seeing that there was still nothing to do but wait, they decided to go back to Fort Hope and rest for a few hours. They had gone some 100 paces, and had reached the dried up bed of Paulina River, when an unexpected noise arrested them. It was a distant rumbling from the northern part of the ice field, and it became louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Something dreadful was going on in the quarter from which it came, and Hobson fancied he felt the ice beneath his feet trembling, which was certainly far from reassuring. "The noise comes from the chain of icebergs," exclaimed Long. "What can be going on there?" Hobson did not answer, but feeling dreadfully anxious, he rushed towards the fort, dragging his companion after him. "To the fort! To the fort!" he cried at last. "The ice may have opened. We may be able to launch our boat on the sea." And the two ran as fast as ever they could towards Fort Hope by the shortest way. A thousand conjectures crowded upon them. From what new phenomenon did the unexpected noise proceed? Did the sleeping inhabitants of the fort know what was going on? They must certainly have heard the noise, for, in vulgar language, it was loud enough to wake the dead. Hobson and Long crossed the 2 miles between them and Fort Hope in 20 minutes, but before they reached the enceinte they saw the men and women they had left asleep hurrying away in terrified disorder, uttering cries of despair. The carpenter Mac Nab, seeing the Lieutenant, ran towards him with his little boy in his arms. "Look, sir, look!" he cried, drawing his master towards a little hill which rose a few yards behind the fort. Hobson obeyed, and saw that part of the ice wall, which when he had left was 2 or 3 miles off in the offing, had fallen upon the coast of the island. Cape Bathurst no longer existed. The mass of earth and sand of which it was composed had been swept away by the icebergs and scattered over the palisades. The principal house and all the buildings connected with it on the north were buried beneath the avalanche. Masses of ice were crowding upon each other, tumbling over with an awful crash, crushing everything beneath them. It was like an army of icebergs taking possession of the island. The boat which had been built at the foot of the cape was completely destroyed. The last hope of the unfortunate colonists was gone. As they stood watching the awful scene, the buildings formerly occupied by the soldiers and women, and from which they had escaped in time, gave way beneath an immense block of ice which fell upon them. A cry of despair burst from the lips of the homeless outcasts. "And the others, where are they?" cried the Lieutenant in heartrending tones. "There," replied Mac Nab, pointing to the heap of sand, earth, and ice, beneath which the principal house had entirely disappeared. Yes, the illustrious lady traveller, Madge, Kalumah, and Thomas Black were buried beneath the avalanche which had surprised them in their sleep. CHAPTER 17. Part II, Chapter 18 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne, Chapter 18. All at Work. Fearful catastrophe had occurred. The ice wall had been flung upon the wandering island. The volume below the water being 5 times that of the projecting part, it had come under the influence of the submarine currents, and, opening a way for itself between the broken ice masses, it had fallen bodily upon Victoria Island, which, driven along by this mighty propelling force, was drifting rapidly to the south. Mac Nab and his companions, aroused by the noise of the avalanche dashing down upon the dog-house, stable and principal house, had been able to escape in time, but now the destruction was complete. Not a trace remained of the buildings in which they had slept, and the island was bearing all its inhabitants with it to the unfathomable depths of the ocean. Perhaps, however, Mrs Barnett, Madge, Kalumah, and the astronomer were still living. Dead or alive, they must be dug out. At this thought Hobson recovered his composure and shouted— "Get shovels and pickaxes. The house is strong, it may have held together. Let us set to work." There were plenty of tools and pickaxes, but it was really impossible to approach the enceinte. The masses of ice were rolling down from the summits of the icebergs, and some parts of the ice wall still towered amongst the ruins 200 feet above the island. The force with which the tossing masses, which seemed to be surging all along the northern horizon, were overthrown can be imagined. The whole coast between the former Cape Bathurst and Cape Esquimaux was not only hemmed in, but literally invaded by these moving mountains, which, impelled by a force they could not resist, had already advanced more than a quarter of a mile inland. Every moment the trembling of the ground and a loud report gave notice that another of these masses had rolled over, and there was a danger that the island would sink beneath the weight thrown upon it. A very apparent lowering of the level had taken place all along that part of the coast near Cape Bathurst. It was evidently gradually sinking down, and the sea had already encroached nearly as far as the lagoon. The situation of the colonists was truly terrible. Unable as they were to attempt to save their companions, and driven from the enceinte by the crashing avalanches, over which they had no power whatever, they could only wait, a prey to the most awful forebodings. Day dawned at last, and how fearful a scene was presented by the districts around Cape Bathurst! The horizon was shut in on every side by ice masses, but their advance seemed to be checked for the moment at least. The ruins of the ice wall were at rest, and it was only now and then that a few blocks rolled down from the still tottering crests of the remaining icebergs. But the whole mass, a great part of its volume being sunk beneath the surface of the sea, was in the grasp of a powerful current, and was driving the island along with it to the south, that is to say, to the ocean, in the depth of which they would alike be engulfed. Those who were thus borne along upon the island were not fully conscious of the peril in which they stood. They had their comrades to save, and amongst them the brave woman who had so won all their hearts, and for whom they would gladly have laid down their lives. The time for action had come. They could again approach the palisades, and there was not a moment to lose, as the poor creatures had already been buried beneath the avalanche for 6 hours. We have already said that Cape Bathurst no longer existed. Struck by a huge iceberg, it had fallen bodily upon the factory, breaking the boat and crushing the dog-house and stable with the poor creatures in them. The principal house next disappeared beneath the masses of earth and sand, upon which rolled blocks of ice to a height of 50 or 60 feet. The court of the fort was filled up. Of the palisade not a post was to be seen, and it was from beneath this accumulation of earth, sand, and ice that the victims were to be dug out. Before beginning to work, Hobson called the head carpenter to him, and asked if he thought the house could bear the weight of the avalanche. "I think so, sir," replied Mac Nab. "In fact, I may almost say I am sure of it. You remember how we strengthened it. It has been casemated, and the vertical beams between the ceilings and floors must have offered great resistance. Moreover, the layer of earth and sand with which the roof was first covered must have broken the shock of the fall of the blocks of ice from the icebergs." "God grant you may be right, Mac Nab," replied Hobson, "and that we may be spared the great grief of losing our friends." The Lieutenant then sent for Mrs Joliffe, and asked her if plenty of provisions had been left in the house. "Oh yes," replied Mrs Joliffe, "there was plenty to eat in the pantry and kitchen." "And any water?" "Yes, water and rum too." "All right, then," said Hobson, "they will not be starved. But how about air?" To this question Mac Nab could make no reply, and if, as he hoped, the house had not given way, the want of air would be the chief danger of the four victims. By prompt measures, however, they might yet be saved, and the first thing to be done was to open a communication with the outer air. All set to work zealously, men and women alike seizing shovels and pickaxes. The masses of ice, sand, and earth were vigorously attacked, at the risk of provoking fresh downfalls, but the proceedings were ably directed by Mac Nab. It appeared to him best to begin at the top of the accumulated masses, so as to roll down loose blocks on the side of the lagoon. The smaller pieces were easily dealt with pick and crowbar, but the large blocks had to be broken up. Some of great size were melted with the aid of a large fire of resinous wood, and every means was tried to destroy or get rid of the ice in the shortest possible time. But so great was the accumulation, that although all worked without pause, except when they snatched a little food, there was no sensible diminution in its amount when the sun disappeared below the horizon. It was not, however, really of quite so great a height as before, and it was determined to go on working from above through the night, and when there was no longer any danger of fresh falls, Mac Nab hoped to be able to sink a vertical shaft in the compact mass, so as to admit the outer air to the house as soon as possible. All night long the party worked at the excavation, attacking the masses with iron and heat, as the one or the other seemed more likely to be effective. The men wielded the pickaxe, while the women kept up the fires, but all were animated by one purpose, the saving of the lives of Mrs Barnett, Madge, Kalumah, and the astronomer. When the morning dawned, the poor creatures had been buried for 30 hours in air necessarily very impure under so thick a cover. The progress made in the night had been so great that Mac Nab prepared to sink his shaft, which he meant to go straight down to the top of the house, and which, according to his calculation, would not have to be more than 50 feet deep. It would be easy enough to sink this shaft through the 20 feet of ice, but great difficulty would be experienced when the earth and sand were reached, as, being very brittle, they would of course constantly fill in the shaft, and its sides would therefore have to be lined. Long pieces of wood were prepared for this purpose, and the boring proceeded. Only 3 men could work at it together, and the soldiers relieved each other constantly, so that the excavation seemed likely to proceed rapidly. As might be supposed, the poor fellows alternated between hope and fear when some obstacle delayed them. When a sudden fall undid their work, they felt discouraged, and nothing but Mac Nab's steady voice could have rallied them. As the men toiled in turn at their weary task, the women stood watching them from the foot of the hill, saying little, but often praying silently. They had now nothing to do but to prepare the food, which the men devoured in their short intervals of repose. The boring proceeded without any very great difficulty, but the ice was so hard that the progress was but slow. At the end of the second day Mac Nab had nearly reached the layer of earth and sand, and could not hope to get to the top of the house before the end of the next day. Night fell, but the work was continued by the light of torches. A snow house was hastily dug out in one of the hummocks on the shore as a temporary shelter for the women and little boy. The wind had veered to the south west, and a cold rain began to fall, accompanied with occasional squalls, but neither the Lieutenant nor his men dreamt of leaving off work. Now began the worst part of the task. It was really impossible to bore in the shifting masses of sand and earth, and it became necessary to prop up the sides of the shaft with wood, the loose earth being drawn to the surface in a bucket hung on a rope. Of course, under the circumstances, the work could not proceed rapidly. Falls might occur at any moment, and the miners were in danger of being buried in their turn. Mac Nab was generally the one to remain at the bottom of the narrow shaft, directing the excavation, and frequently sounding with a long pick, but as it met with no resistance, it was evident that it did not reach the roof of the house. When the morning once more dawned, only 10 feet had been excavated in the mass of earth and sand, so that 20 remained to be bored through before the roof of the house could be reached, that is to say, if it had not given way, and still occupied the position it did before the fall of the avalanche. It was now 54 hours since Mrs Barnett and her companions were buried. Mac Nab and the Lieutenant often wondered if they on their side had made any effort to open a communication with the outer air. They felt sure that with her usual courage Mrs Barnett would have tried to find some way out if her movements were free. Some tools had been left in the house, and Kellet, one of the carpenter's men, remembered leaving his pickaxe in the kitchen. The prisoners might have broken open one of the doors and begun to pierce a gallery across the layer of earth, but such a gallery could only be driven in a horizontal direction, and would be a much longer business than the sinking of a shaft from above, for the masses flung down by the avalanche, although only 60 feet deep, covered a space more than 500 feet in diameter. Of course the prisoners could not be aware of this fact, and if they should succeed in boring their horizontal gallery, it would be 8 days at least before they could cut through the last layer of ice, and by that time they would be totally deprived of air, if not of food. Nevertheless, the Lieutenant carefully went over every portion of the accumulation himself, and listened intently for any sounds of subterranean digging, but he heard nothing. On the return of the day the men toiled with fresh energy. Bucket after bucket was drawn to the surface of the shaft loaded with earth. The clumsy wooden props answered admirably in keeping the earth from filling in the pit. A few falls occurred, but they were rapidly checked, and no fresh misfortunes occurred throughout the day, except that the soldier Garry received a blow on the head from a falling block of ice. The wound was not, however, severe, and he would not leave his work. At 4 o'clock the shaft was 50 feet deep altogether, having been sunk through 20 feet of ice and 30 of sand and earth. It was at this depth that Mac Nab had expected to reach the roof of the house, if it had resisted the pressure of the avalanche. He was then at the bottom of the shaft, and his disappointment and dismay can be imagined when, on driving his pickaxe into the ground as far as it would go, it met with no resistance whatever. Sabine was with him, and for a few moments he remained with his arms crossed, silently looking at his companion. "No roof, then?" inquired the hunter. "Nothing whatever," replied the carpenter, "but let us work on. The roof has bent out of course, but the floor of the loft cannot have given way. Another 10 feet and we shall come to that floor, or else—" Mac Nab did not finish his sentence, and the two resumed their work with the strength of despair. At 6 o'clock in the evening another 10 or 12 feet had been dug out. Mac Nab sounded again. Nothing yet. His pick still sunk in the shifting earth, and flinging it from him, he buried his face in his hands and muttered, "Poor things, poor things!" He then climbed to the opening of the shaft by means of the woodwork. The Lieutenant and the Sergeant were together in greater anxiety than ever, and taking them aside, the carpenter told them of his dreadful disappointment. "Then," observed Hobson, "the house must have been crushed by the avalanche, and the poor people in it." "No!" cried the head carpenter, with earnest conviction. "No, it cannot have been crushed. It must have resisted, strengthened as it was. It cannot have been crushed." "Well, then, what has happened?" said the Lieutenant in a broken voice, his eyes filling with tears. "Simply this," replied Mac Nab. "The house itself has remained intact, but the ground on which it was built must have sunk. The house has gone through the crust of ice which formed the foundation of the island. It has not been crushed, but engulfed, and the poor creatures in it—" "Are drowned!" cried Long. "Yes, Sergeant, drowned without a moment's notice, drowned like the passengers on a foundered vessel." For some minutes the three men remained silent. Mac Nab's idea was probably correct. Nothing was more likely than that the ice forming the foundation of the island had given way under such enormous pressure. The vertical props which supported the beams of the ceiling, and rested on those of the floor, had evidently aided the catastrophe by their weight, and the whole house had been engulfed. "Well, Mac Nab," said Hobson at last, "if we cannot find them alive—" "We must recover their bodies," added the head carpenter. And with these words Mac Nab, accompanied by the Lieutenant, went back to his work at the bottom of the shaft, without a word to any of his comrades of the terrible form his anxiety had now assumed. The excavation continued throughout the night, the men relieving each other every hour, and Hobson and Mac Nab watched them at work without a moment's rest. At 3 o'clock in the morning Kellet's pickaxe struck against something hard, which gave out a ringing sound. The head carpenter felt it almost before he heard it. "We have reached them!" cried the soldier. "They are saved!" "Hold your tongue and go on working," replied the Lieutenant in a choked voice. It was now 76 hours since the avalanche fell upon the house. Kellet and his companion Pond resumed their work. The shaft must have nearly reached the level of the sea, and Mac Nab therefore felt that all hope was gone. In less than 20 minutes the hard body which Kellet had struck was uncovered, and proved to be one of the rafters of the roof. The carpenter flung himself to the bottom of the shaft, and seizing the pickaxe, sent the laths of the roof flying on every side. In a few moments a large aperture was made, and a figure appeared at it which was difficult to recognise in the darkness. It was Kalumah. "Help! Help!" she murmured feebly. Hobson let himself down through the opening, and found himself up to the waist in ice cold water. Strange to say, the roof had not given way, but as Mac Nab had supposed, the house had sunk, and was full of water. The water did not, however, yet fill the loft, and was not more than a foot above the floor. There was still a faint hope. The Lieutenant, feeling his way in the darkness, came across a motionless body, and dragging it to the opening he consigned it to Pond and Kellet. It was Thomas Black. Madge, also senseless, was next found, and she and the astronomer were drawn up to the surface of the ground with ropes, where the open air gradually restored them to consciousness. Mrs Barnett was still missing, but Kalumah led Hobson to the very end of the loft, and there he found the unhappy lady motionless and insensible, with her head scarcely out of the water. The Lieutenant lifted her in his arms and carried her to the opening, and a few moments later he had reached the outer air with his burden, followed by Mac Nab with Kalumah. Every one gathered round Mrs Barnett in silent anxiety, and poor Kalumah, exhausted as she was, flung herself across her friend's body. Mrs Barnett still breathed, her heart still beat feebly, and revived by the pure fresh air she at last opened her eyes. A cry of joy burst from every lip, a cry of gratitude to heaven for the great mercy vouchsafed, which was doubtless heard above. Day was now breaking in the east, the sun was rising above the horizon, lighting up the ocean with its brilliant beams. Mrs Barnett painfully staggered to her feet. Looking round her from the summit of the new mountain formed by the avalanche, which overlooked the whole island, she murmured in a changed and hollow voice— "The sea! The sea!" Yes, the ocean now encircled the wandering island. The sea was open at last, and a true sea horizon shut in the view from east to west. Chapter 18. Part 2, Chapter 19 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 19. Bering Sea. The island, driven by the ice wall, had then drifted at a great speed into Bering Sea, after crossing the strait without running aground on its shores. It was still hurrying on before the icy barrier, which was in the grasp of a powerful submarine current, hastening onwards on to its inevitable dissolution in the warmer waters of the Pacific, and the boat on which all had depended was useless. As soon as Mrs Barnett had entirely recovered consciousness, she related in a few words the history of the 74 hours spent in the house now in the water. Thomas Black, Madge, and Kalumah had been aroused by the crash of the avalanche, and had rushed to the doors or windows. There was no longer any possibility of getting out. The mass of earth and sand, which was but a moment before Cape Bathurst, completely covered the house, and almost immediately afterwards the prisoners heard the crash of the huge ice masses which were flung upon the factory. In another quarter of an hour all felt that the house, whilst resisting the enormous pressure, was sinking through the soil of the island. They knew that the crust of ice must have given way, and that the house would fill with water. To seize a few provisions remaining in the pantry, and to take refuge in the loft, was the work of a moment. This the poor creatures did from a dim instinct of self-preservation, but what hope could they really have of being saved? However, the loft seemed likely to resist, and 2 blocks of ice abutting from the roof saved it from being immediately crushed. Whilst thus imprisoned, the poor creatures could hear the constant falls from the icebergs, while the sea was gradually rising through the lower rooms. They must either be crushed or drowned. But by little short of a miracle, the roof of the house, with its strong framework, resisted the pressure, and after sinking a certain depth, the house remained stationary, with the water rather above the floor of the loft. The prisoners were obliged to take refuge amongst the rafters of the roof, and there they remained for many hours. Kalumah devoted herself to the service of the others, and carried food to them through the water. They could make no attempt to save themselves. Succour could only come from without. It was a terrible situation, for breathing was difficult in the vitiated air, deficient as it was in oxygen, and charged with a great excess of carbonic acid. A few hours later Hobson would only have found the corpses of his friends. The horror of the position was increased by the gushing of the water through the lower rooms, which convinced Mrs Barnett that the island was drifting to the south. She had, in fact, guessed the whole truth. She knew that the ice wall had heeled over and fallen upon the island, and concluded that the boat was destroyed. It was this fact which gave such terrible significance to her first words when she looked around her after her swoon. The sea, the sea! Those about her, however, could think of nothing yet but the fact that they had saved her for whom they would have died, and with her Madge, Kalumah, and Thomas Black. Thus far not one of those who had joined the Lieutenant in his disastrous expedition had succumbed to any of the fearful dangers through which they had passed. But matters were not yet at their worst, and fresh troubles were soon to hasten the final catastrophe. Hobson's first care after Mrs Barnett's recovery was to take the bearings of the island. It was listless now to think of quitting it, as the sea was open and their boat destroyed. A few ruins alone remained of the mighty ice wall, the upper portion of which had crushed Cape Bathurst, whilst the submerged base was driving the island to the south. The instruments and maps belonging to the astronomer were found in the ruins of the house, and were fortunately uninjured. The weather was cloudy, but Hobson succeeded in taking the altitude of the sun with sufficient accuracy for his purpose. We give the result obtained at noon on the 12th May. Victoria Island was then situated in longitude 168° 12' west of Greenwich, and in latitude 63° 37' north. The exact spot was looked out on the chart, and proved to be in Norton Sound, between Cape Chaplin on the Asiatic and Cape Stephens on the American coast, but 100 miles from either. "We must give up all hope of making the land of the continent, then," said Mrs Barnett. "Yes, madam," replied Hobson, "all hope of that is at an end. The current is carrying us with great rapidity out into the offing, and our only chance is that we may pass within sight of a whaler." "Well, but," added Mrs Barnett, "if we cannot make the land of either continent, might not the current drive us to one of the islands of Behring Sea?" There was in fact a slight possibility that such a thing might happen, and all eagerly clutched at the hope, like a drowning man at a plank. There are plenty of islands in the Behring Sea: St Lawrence, St Matthew, Nunivak, St Paul, George Island, etc. The wandering island was in fact at that moment not far from St Lawrence, which is of considerable size, and surrounded with islets, and should it pass it without stopping, there was yet a hope that the cluster of the Aleutian Islands bounding Behring Sea on the south might arrest its course. Yes, St Lawrence might be a harbour of refuge for the colonists, and if it failed them, St Matthew and the group of islets of which it is the centre would still be left. It would not do, however, to count upon the Aleutian Islands, which were more than 800 miles away, and which they might never reach. Long, long before they got so far, Victoria Island, worn away by the warm sea waves, and melted by the rays of the sun, which was already in the sign of Gemini, would most likely have sunk to the bottom of the ocean. There is, however, no fixed point beyond which floating ice does not advance. It approaches nearer to the equator in the southern than in the northern hemisphere. Icebergs have been seen off the Cape of Good Hope, at about 36° south latitude, but those which come down from the Arctic Ocean have never passed 40° north latitude. The weather conditions, which are of course variable, determine the exact locality where ice will melt. In severe and prolonged winters it remains solid in comparatively low latitudes, and vice versa in early springs. Now the warm season of 1861 had set in very early, and this would hasten the dissolution of Victoria Island. The waters of Behring Sea had already changed from blue to green, as the great navigator Hudson observed they always do on the approach of icebergs, so that a catastrophe might be expected at any moment. Hobson determined to do his best to avert the coming misfortune, and ordered a raft to be constructed which could carry the whole colony, and might be guided to the continent somehow or other. There was every chance of meeting vessels now that the whaling season had commenced, and Mac Nab was commissioned to make a large solid raft which would float when Victoria Island was engulfed. But first of all it was necessary to construct some shelter for the homeless inhabitants of the island. The simple plan appeared to be to dig out the old barracks, which had been built on to the principal house, and the walls of which were still standing. Every one set to work with a hearty good will, and in a few days a shelter was provided from the inclemencies of the fickle weather. Search was also made in the ruins of the large house, and a good many articles of more or less value were saved from the submerged rooms: tools, arms, furniture, the air pumps, and the air vessel, etc. On the 13th May all hope of drifting to the island of St Lawrence had to be abandoned. When the bearings were taken, it was found that they were passing at a considerable distance to the east of that island, and, as Hobson was well aware, currents do not run against natural obstacles, but turn them, so that little hope could be entertained of thus making the land. It is true the network of islands in the Catherine Archipelago, scattered over several degrees of latitude, might stop the island if it ever got so far. But, as we have stated before, that was not probable, although it was advancing at great speed, for this speed must decrease considerably when the ice wall which was driving it along should be broken away or dissolved, unprotected as it was from the heat of the sun by any covering of earth or sand. Lieutenant Hobson, Mrs Barnett, Sergeant Long, and the head carpenter often discussed these matters, and came to the conclusion that the island could certainly never reach the Aleutian group with so many chances against it. On the 14th May, Mac Nab and his men commenced the construction of a huge raft. It had to be as high as possible above the water, to prevent the waves from breaking over it, so that it was really a formidable undertaking. The blacksmith Rae had fortunately found a large number of the iron bolts which had been brought from Fort Reliance, and they were invaluable for firmly fastening together the different portions of the framework of the raft. We must describe the novel site for the building of the raft suggested by Lieutenant Hobson. Instead of joining the timbers and planks together on the ground, they were joined on the surface of the lake. The different pieces of wood were prepared on the banks, and launched separately. They were then easily fitted together on the water. This mode of proceeding had two advantages. One, the carpenter would be able at once to judge of the point of flotation, and the stability which would be given to the raft. Two, when Victoria Island melted, the raft would already be floating, and would not be liable to the shocks it would receive if on land when the inevitable break-up came. Whilst these works were going on, Hobson would wander about on the beach, either alone or with Mrs Barnett, examining the state of the sea, and the ever-changing windings of the coast line, worn by the constant action of the waves. He would gaze upon the vast deserted ocean, from which the very icebergs had now disappeared, watching, ever watching, like a shipwrecked mariner for the vessel which never came. The ocean solitudes were only frequented by cetacea, which came to feed upon the microscopic animalculae which formed their principal food, and abound in the green waters. Now and then floating trees of different kinds, which had been brought by the great ocean currents from warm latitudes, passed the island on their way to the north. On the 16th May, Mrs Barnett and Madge were walking together on that part of the island between the former Cape Bathurst and Port Barnett. It was a fine warm day, and there had been no traces of snow on the ground for some time. All that recalled the bitter cold of the Polar regions were the relics left by the ice wall on the northern part of the island, but even these were rapidly melting, and every day fresh waterfalls poured from their summits and bathed their sides. Very soon the sun would have completely dissolved every atom of ice. Strange indeed was the aspect of Victoria Island. But for their terrible anxiety, the colonists must have gazed at it with eager interest. The ground was more prolific than it could have been in any former spring, transferred as it was to milder latitudes. The little mosses and tender flowers grew rapidly, and Mrs Joliffe's garden was wonderfully successful. The vegetation of every kind, hitherto checked by the rigour of the Arctic winter, was not only more abundant but more brilliantly coloured. The hues of leaves and flowers were no longer pale and watery, but warm and glowing like the sunbeams which called them forth. The arbutus, willow, birch, fir, and pine trees were clothed with dark verdure. The sap, sometimes heated in a temperature of 68° Fahrenheit, burst open the young buds. In a word, the Arctic landscape was completely transformed, for the island was now beneath the same parallel of latitude as Christiania or Stockholm, that is to say, in one of the finest districts of the temperate zones. But Mrs Barnett had now no eyes for these wonderful phenomena of nature. The shadow of the coming doom clouded her spirit. She shared the feeling of desperation manifested by the hundreds of animals now collected round the factory. The foxes, martens, ermines, lynxes, beavers, muskrats, gluttons, and even the wolves, rendered less savage by their instinctive knowledge of a common danger, approached nearer and nearer to their old enemy, as if man could save them. It was a tacit, a touching acknowledgment of human superiority, under circumstances in which that superiority could be of absolutely no avail. No, Mrs Barnett cared no longer for the beauties of nature, and gazed without ceasing upon the boundless, pitiless, infinite ocean, with its unbroken horizon. "Poor Madge!" she said at last to her faithful companion, "it was I who brought you to this terrible pass. You who have followed me everywhere, and whose fidelity deserved a far different recompense. Can you forgive me?" "There is but one thing I could never have forgiven you," replied Madge, "a death I did not share." "Ah, Madge!" cried Mrs Barnett, "if my death could have saved the lives of all these poor people, how gladly would I die!" "My dear girl," replied Madge, "have you lost all hope at last?" "I have indeed," murmured Mrs Barnett, hiding her face on Madge's shoulder. The strong masculine nature had given way at last, and Mrs Barnett was for a moment a feeble woman. Was not her emotion excusable in so awful a situation? Mrs Barnett sobbed aloud, and large tears rolled down her cheeks. Madge kissed and caressed her, and tried all she could to reassure her, and presently raising her head, her poor mistress said— "Do not tell them, Madge, how I have given way. Do not betray that I have wept." "Of course not," said Madge, "and they would not believe me if I did. It was but a moment's weakness. Be yourself, dear girl; cheer up and take fresh courage." "Do you mean to say you still hope yourself?" exclaimed Mrs Barnett, looking anxiously into her companion's face. "I still hope," said Madge simply. But a few days afterwards every chance of safety seemed to indeed be gone, when the wandering island passed outside the St Matthew group, and drifted away from the last land in Behring Sea. CHAPTER XX. Part II, Chapter 20 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 20. In the Offing. Victoria Island was now floating in the widest part of Behring Sea, 600 miles from the nearest of the Aleutian Islands, and 200 miles from the nearest land, which was on the east. Supposing no accident happened, it would be 3 weeks at least before this southern boundary of Behring Sea could be reached. Could the island last so long? Might it not burst open at any moment, subject as it was to even now the constant action of tepid water, the mean temperature of which was more than 50° Fahrenheit? Lieutenant Hobson pressed on the construction of the raft as rapidly as possible, and the lower framework was already floating on the lagoon. Mac Nab wished to make it as strong as possible, for it would have a considerable distance to go to reach the Aleutian Islands, unless they were fortunate enough to meet with a whaler. No important alteration had lately taken place in the general configuration of the island. Reconnaissances were taken every day, but great caution was necessary, as a fracture of the ground might at any moment cut off the explorers from the rest of the party. The wide gulf near Cape Michael, which the winter had closed, had reopened gradually, and now ran a mile inland, as far as the dried up bed of the little river. It was probable that it was soon to extend to the bed itself, which was of course of little thickness, having been hollowed out by the stream. Should it do so, the whole district between Cape Michael and Port Barnett, bounded on the west by the river bed, would disappear. That is to say, the colonists would lose a good many square miles of their dominion. On this account Hobson warned every one not to wander far, as a rough sea would be enough to bring about the dreaded catastrophe. Soundings were, however, taken in several places, with a view to ascertaining where the ice was thickest, and it was found that, near Cape Bathurst, not only was the layer of earth and sand of greater extent, which was of little importance, but the crust of ice was thicker than anywhere else. This was a most fortunate circumstance, and the holes made in sounding were kept open, so that the amount of diminution in the base of the island could be estimated every day. This diminution was slow but sure, and making allowances for the unfortunate fact that the island was drifting into warmer waters, it was decided that it was impossible for it to last another 3 weeks. The next week, from the 19th to the 25th May, the weather was very bad. A fearful storm broke over the island, accompanied by flash after flash of lightning and peals of thunder. The sea rose high, lashed by a powerful north-west wind, and its waves broke over the doomed island, making it tremble ominously. The little colony were on the watch, ready on an emergency to embark in the raft, the scaffolding of which was nearly finished, and some provisions and fresh water were taken on board. Rain heavy enough to penetrate the ice crust fell in large quantities during this storm, and melted it in many places. On the slopes of some of the hills the earth was washed away, leaving the white foundations bare. These ravines were hastily filled up with soil to protect the ice from the action of the warm air and rain, and but for this precaution the soil would have been everywhere perforated. Great havoc was caused amongst the woods by this storm. The earth and sand were washed away from the roots of the trees, which fell in large numbers. In a single night the aspect of the country between the lake and the former Port Barnett was completely changed. A few groups of birch trees and thickets of firs alone remained, a fact significant of approaching decomposition, which no human skill could prevent. Every one knew and felt that the ephemeral island was gradually succumbing, every one except Thomas Black, who was still gloomily indifferent to all that was going on. On the 23rd of May, during the storm, the hunter Sabine left the house in the thick fog, and was nearly drowned in a large hole which had opened during the night on the site formerly occupied by the principal house of the factory. Hitherto, as we are aware, the house, three-quarters submerged, and buried beneath a mass of earth and sand, had remained fixed in the ice crust beneath the island. But now the sea had evidently enlarged the crevice, and the house with all it contained had sunk to rise no more. Earth and sand were pouring through this fissure, at the bottom of which surged the tempest-tossed waves. Sabine's comrades, hearing his cries, rushed to his assistance, and were just in time to save him, as he was still clinging to the slippery walls of the abyss. He escaped with a ducking which might have had tragic consequences. A little later the beams and planks of the house, which had slid under the island, were seen floating about in the offing like the spars of a wrecked vessel. This was the worst the evil storm had wrought, and would compromise the solidity of the island yet more, as the waves would now eat away the ice all around the crevasse. In the course of the 25th May the wind veered to the northeast, and although it blew strongly, it was no longer a hurricane. The rains ceased, and the sea became calmer. After a quiet night the sun rose upon the desolate scene. The Lieutenant was able to take the bearings accurately, and obtained the following result. At noon on the 25th of May, Victoria Island was in latitude 56 degrees 13 minutes, and longitude 170 degrees 23 minutes. It had therefore advanced at great speed, having drifted nearly 800 miles since the breaking up of the ice set it free in Behring Strait 2 months before. The great speed made the Lieutenant once more entertain a slight hope. He pointed out the Aleutian Islands on the map to his comrades, and said— "Look at these islands. They are not now 200 miles from us, and we may reach them in 8 days." "8 days!" repeated Long, shaking his head. "8 days is a long time." "I must add," continued Hobson, "that if our island had followed the 168th meridian, it would already have reached the parallel of these islands. But in consequence of a deviation of the Behring current, it is bearing in a south-westerly direction." The Lieutenant was right. The current seemed likely to drag the islands away from all land, even out of the sight of the Aleutian Islands, which only extend as far as the 170th meridian. Mrs Barnett examined the map in silence. She saw the pencil mark which denoted the exact spot then occupied by the island. The map was on a large scale, and the point representing the island looked but a speck upon the vast expanse of the Behring Sea. She traced back the route by which the island had come to its present position, marvelling at the fatality, or rather the immutable law, by which the currents had borne it along, had avoided all land, sheering clear of islands, and never touching either continent; and she saw the boundless Pacific Ocean, towards which she and all with her were hurrying. She mused long upon this melancholy subject, and at last exclaimed suddenly— "Could not the course of the island be controlled? 8 days at this pace would bring us to the last island of the Aleutian group." "Those 8 days are in the hands of God," replied Lieutenant Hobson gravely. "We can exercise no control upon them. Help can only come to us from above. There is nothing left for us to try." "I know," said Mrs Barnett; "but Heaven helps those who help themselves. Is there really nothing we can do?" Hobson shook his head doubtfully. His only hope was in the raft, and he was undecided whether to embark every one on it at once, contrive some sort of sail with cloths, etc., and try to reach the nearest land, or to wait yet a little longer. He consulted Sergeant Long, Mac Nab, Rae, Marbre, and Sabine, in whom he had great confidence, and all agreed it would be unwise to abandon the island before they were obliged. The raft, constantly swept as it would be by the waves, could only be a last resort, and would not move at half the pace of the island, still driven towards the south by the remains of the ice wall. The wind generally blew from the east, and would be likely to drift the raft out into the offing, away from all land. They must still wait then, always wait, for the island was drifting rapidly towards the Aleutians. When they really approached the group they would be able to see what it would be best to do. This was certainly the wisest course to take. In 8 days, if the present speed were maintained, the island would either stop at the southern boundary of Behring Sea, or be dragged to the south-west to the waters of the Pacific Ocean, where certain destruction awaited it. But the adverse fate which seemed all along to have followed the hapless colonists had yet another blow in store for them. The speed on which they counted was now to fail them, as everything else had done. During the night of the 26th May the orientation of the island changed once more, and this time the results of the displacement were extremely serious. The island turned half round, and the icebergs still remaining of the huge ice wall, which had shut in the northern horizons, were now on the south. In the morning the shipwrecked travellers, what name could be more appropriate, saw the sun rise above Cape Esquimaux instead of above Port Barnett. Hardly 100 yards off rose the icebergs, rapidly melting, but still of considerable size, which till then had driven the island before them. The southern horizon was now partly shut in by them. What would be the consequences of this fresh change of position? Would not the icebergs now float away from the island, with which they were no longer connected? All were oppressed with a presentiment of some new misfortune, and understood only too well what Kellet meant when he exclaimed— "This evening we shall have lost our screw." By this Kellet meant that the icebergs, being before instead of behind the island, would soon leave it, and as it was they which imparted to its rapid motion, in consequence of their very great draught of water, their volume being 6 or 7 feet below the sea level for every one above, they would now go on without it, impelled by the submarine current, whilst Victoria Island, not deep enough in the water to come under the influence of the current, would be left floating helplessly on the waves. Yes, Kellet was right. The island would then be like a vessel with disabled masts and a broken screw. No one answered the soldier's remark, and a quarter of an hour had not elapsed before a loud cracking sound was heard. The summits of the icebergs trembled, large masses broke away, and the icebergs, irresistibly drawn along by the submarine current, drifted rapidly to the south. Chapter 20. Part 2, Chapter 21 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 21. The Island Becomes an Islet. 3 hours later the last relics of the ice wall had disappeared, proving that the island now remained stationary, and that all the force of the current was deep down below the waves, not on the surface of the sea. The bearings were taken at noon with the greatest care, and 24 hours later it was found that Victoria Island had not advanced 1 mile. The only remaining hope was that some vessel should sight the poor shipwrecked creatures, either whilst still on the island or after they had taken to their raft. The island was now in 54 degrees 33 minutes latitude and 177 degrees 19 minutes longitude, several hundred miles from the nearest land, namely the Aleutian Islands. Hobson once more called his comrades together, and asked them what they thought it would be best to do. All agreed that they should remain on the island until it broke up, as it was too large to be affected by the state of the sea, and only to take to the raft when the dissolution actually commenced. Once on the frail vessel they must wait, still wait. The raft was now finished. Mac Nab had made one large shed or cabin, big enough to hold every one, and to afford some little shelter from the weather. A mast had been prepared, which could be put up if necessary, and the sails intended for the boat had long been ready. The whole structure was strong, although clumsy, and if the wind were favourable and the sea not too rough, this rude assortment of planks and timbers might save the lives of the whole party. "Nothing," observed Mrs Barnett, "nothing is impossible to Him who rules the winds and the waves." Hobson carefully looked over the stores of provisions. The reserves had been much damaged by the avalanche, but there were plenty of animals still on the island, and the abundant shrubs and mosses supplied them with food. A few reindeer and hares were slaughtered by the hunters, and their flesh salted for future needs. The health of the colonists was on the whole good. They had suffered little in the preceding mild winter, and all the mental trials they had gone through had not affected their physical well-being. They were, however, looking forward with something of a shrinking horror to the moment when they should have to abandon their island home, or to speak more correctly, when it abandoned them. It was no wonder that they did not like the thought of floating on the ocean in a rude structure of wood, subject to all the caprices of winds and waves. Even in tolerably fine weather seas would be shipped, and every one constantly drenched with salt water. Moreover, it must be remembered that the men were none of them sailors, accustomed to navigation, and ready to risk their lives on a few planks, but soldiers trained for service on land. Their island was fragile, it is true, and rested on a thin crust of ice, but then it was covered with a productive soil. Trees and shrubs flourished upon it. Its huge bulk rendered it insensible to the motion of the waves, and it might have been supposed to be stationary. They had in fact become attached to Victoria Island, on which they had lived nearly 2 years. Every inch of the ground had become familiar to them. They had tilled the soil, and had come safely through so many perils in their wandering home, that in leaving it they felt as if they were parting from an old and sorely tried friend. Hobson fully sympathized with the feeling of his men, and understood their repugnance to embarking on the raft. But then he also knew that the catastrophe could not now be deferred much longer, and ominous symptoms already gave warning of its rapid approach. We will now describe this raft. It was 30 feet square, and its deck rose 2 feet above the water. Its bulwarks would therefore be kept out of the small but not the large waves. In the centre the carpenter had built a regular deck-house, which would hold some 20 people. Round it were large lockers for the provisions and water casks, all firmly fixed to the deck with iron bolts. The mast, 30 feet high, was fastened to the deck house, and strengthened with stays attached to the corners of the raft. The mast was to have a square sail, which would only be useful when the wind was aft. A sort of rudder was fixed to this rough structure, the fittings of which were necessarily incomplete. Such was the raft constructed by the head carpenter, on which 21 persons were to embark. It was floating peacefully on the little lake, strongly moored to the shore. It was certainly constructed with more care than if it had been put together in haste on a vessel at sea doomed to immediate destruction. It was stronger and better fitted up, but after all it was but a raft. On the 1st June a new incident occurred. Hope, one of the soldiers, went to fetch some water from the lake for culinary purposes, and when Mrs Joliffe tasted it, she found that it was salt. She called Hope, and said she wanted fresh, not salt water. The man replied that he had brought it from the lake as usual, and as he and Mrs Joliffe were disputing about it, the Lieutenant happened to come in. Hearing Hope's repeated assertions that he had fetched the water from the lake, he turned pale, and hurried to the lagoon. The waters were quite salt. The bottom of the lake had evidently given way, and the sea had flowed in. The fact quickly became known, and every one was seized with a terrible dread. "No more fresh water!" exclaimed all the poor creatures together. Lake Barnett had in fact disappeared, as Paulina River had done before. Lieutenant Hobson hastened to reassure his comrades about drinkable water. "There will be plenty of ice, my friends," he said. "We can always melt a piece of our island, and," he added with ghastly attempt at a smile, "I don't suppose we shall drink it all." It is, in fact, well known that salt separates from sea water in freezing and evaporation. A few blocks of ice were therefore disinterred, if we may so express it, and melted for daily use, and to fill the casks on board the raft. It would not do, however, to neglect this fresh warning given by nature. The invasion of the lake by the sea proved that the base of the island was rapidly melting. At any moment the ground might give way, and Hobson forbade his men to leave the factory, as they might be drifted away before they were aware of it. The animals seemed more keenly alive than ever to approaching danger. They gathered yet more closely round the firmer part, and after the disappearance of the fresh-water lake they came to lick the blocks of ice. They were all uneasy, and some seemed to be seized with madness, especially the wolves, who rushed wildly towards the factory, and dashed away again, howling piteously. The furred animals remained huddled together round the large well where the principal house had formerly stood. There were several hundreds of them, of different species, and the solitary bear roamed backwards and forwards, showing no more hostility to the quadrupeds than to men. The number of birds, which had hitherto been considerable, now decreased. During the last few days all those capable of long sustained flight, such as swans, etc., migrated towards the Aleutian Islands in the south, where they would find a sure refuge. This significant and ominous fact was noted by Mrs Barnett and Madge, who were walking together on the beach. "There is plenty of food for these birds on the island," observed Mrs Barnett, "and yet they leave it. They have good reason, no doubt." "Yes," replied Madge, "their instinct of self-preservation makes them take flight, and they give us a warning by which we ought to profit. The animals also appear more uneasy than usual." Hobson now decided to take the greater part of the provisions and all the camping apparatus on board the raft, and when that was done to embark with the whole party. The sea was, however, very rough, and the waters of the former lake, now a kind of Mediterranean in miniature, were greatly agitated. The waves, confined in the narrow space, dashed mountains high, and broke violently upon the steep banks. The raft tossed up and down, and shipped sea after sea. The embarkation of provisions, etc., had to be put off. Every one wished to pass one more quiet night on land, and Hobson yielded against his better judgment. determined, if it were calmer the next day, to proceed with the embarkation. The night was more peaceful than had been expected. The wind went down, and the sea became calmer. It had but been swept by one of those sudden and brief hurricanes peculiar to these latitudes. At 8 o'clock in the evening the tumult ceased, and a slight surface agitation of the waters of the lake and sea alone remained. It was some slight comfort that the island would not now be broken up suddenly, as it must have done had the storm continued. Its dissolution was, of course, still close at hand, but would not, it was hoped, be sudden and abrupt. The storm was succeeded by a slight fog, which seemed likely to thicken during the night. It came from the north, and owing to the changed position of the island, would probably cover the greater part of it. Before going to bed, Hobson went down and examined the moorings of the raft, which were fastened to some strong birch trees. To make security doubly sure, he tightened them, and the worst that could now happen would be that the raft would drift out into the lagoon, which was not large enough to be lost upon it. Chapter 21. Part 2, Chapter 22 of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 22. The 4 following days. The night was calm, and in the morning the Lieutenant resolved to order the embarkation of everything and everybody that very day. He therefore went down to the lake to look at the raft. The fog was still thick, but the sunbeams were beginning to struggle through it. The clouds had been swept away by the hurricane of the preceding day, and it seemed likely to be hot. When Hobson reached the banks of the lake, the fog was still too dense for him to make out anything on its surface, and he was waiting for it to clear away, when he was joined by Mrs Barnett, Madge, and several others. The fog gradually cleared off, drawing back to the end of the lake, but the raft was nowhere to be seen. Presently a gust of wind completely swept away the fog. The raft was gone. There was no longer a lake. The boundless ocean stretched away before the astonished colonists. Hobson could not check a cry of despair, and when he and his companions turned round and saw the sea on every side, they realized with a shock of horror that their island was now nothing more than an islet. During the night 6/7 of the district once belonging to Cape Bathurst had silently floated away, without producing a shock of any kind. So completely had the ice been worn away by the constant action of the waves. The raft had drifted out into the offing, and those whose last hope it had been could not see a sign of it on the desolate sea. The unfortunate colonists were now overwhelmed with despair. Their last hope gone, they were hanging above an awful abyss ready to swallow them up, and some of the soldiers in a fit of madness were about to throw themselves into the sea, when Mrs Barnett flung herself before them, entreating them to desist. They yielded, some of them weeping like children. The awful situation of the colonists was indeed manifest enough, and we may well pity the Lieutenant, surrounded by the miserable despairing creatures. 21 persons on an islet of ice, which must quickly melt beneath their feet. The wooded hills had disappeared with the mass of the island now engulfed. Not a tree was left. There was no wood remaining but the planks of the rough lodging, which would not be nearly enough to hold a raft to hold so many. A few days of life were all the colonists could now hope for. June had set in. The mean temperature exceeded 68° Fahrenheit, and the island must rapidly melt. As a forlorn hope, Hobson thought he would make a reconnaissance of his limited domain, and see if any part of it was thicker than where they were all now encamped. In this excursion he was accompanied by Mrs Barnett and Madge. "Do you still hope?" inquired the lady of her faithful companion. "I hope ever," replied Madge. Mrs Barnett did not answer, but walked rapidly along the coast at the Lieutenant's side. No alteration had taken place between Cape Bathurst and Cape Esquimaux, that is to say, for a distance of 8 miles. It was at Cape Esquimaux that the fracture had taken place, and running inland it followed a curved line as far as the beginning of the lagoon, from which point the shores of the lake, now bathed by the waves of the sea, formed the new coast line. Towards the upper part of the lagoon there was another fracture, running as far as the coast, between Cape Bathurst and what was once Port Barnett, so that the islet was merely an oblong strip, not more than a mile wide anywhere. Of the 140 square miles which once formed the total superficial area of the island, only 20 remained. Hobson most carefully examined the new conformation of the islet, and found that its thickest part was still at the site of the former factory. He decided, therefore, to retain the encampment where it was, and, strange to say, the instinct of the quadrupeds still led them to congregate about it. A great many of the animals had, however, disappeared with the rest of the island, amongst them many of the dogs which had escaped the former catastrophe. Most of the quadrupeds remaining were rodents, and the bear, which seemed terribly puzzled, paced round and round the islet like a caged animal. About 5 o'clock in the evening the three explorers returned to the camp. The men and women were gathered together in gloomy silence in the rough shelter still remaining to them, and Mrs Joliffe was preparing some food. Sabine, who was less overcome than his comrades, was wandering about in the hope of getting some fresh venison, and the astronomer was sitting apart from every one, gazing at the sea in an absent, indifferent manner, as if nothing could ever rouse or astonish him again. The Lieutenant imparted the results of his excursion to the whole party. He told them that they were safer where they were than they would be on any other spot, and he urged them not to wander about, as there were signs of another approaching fracture half way between the camp and Cape Esquimaux. The superficial area of the islet would soon be yet further reduced, and they could do nothing, absolutely nothing. The day was really quite hot. The ice which had been disinterred for drinkable water melted before it was brought near the fire. Thin pieces of the ice crust of the steep beach fell off into the sea, and it was evident that the general level of the islet was being lowered by the constant wearing away of its base in the tepid waters. No one slept the next night. Who could have closed his eyes with the knowledge that the abyss might open at any moment? Who but the little unconscious child who still smiled in his mother's arms, and was never for one instant out of them? The next morning, June 4th, the sun rose in a cloudless sky. No change had taken place in the conformation of the islet during the night. In the course of this day a terrified blue fox rushed into the shed, and could not be induced to leave it. The martens, ermines, polar hares, muskrats, and beavers literally swarmed upon the site of the former factory. The wolves alone were unrepresented, and had probably all been swallowed up with the rest of the island. The bear no longer wandered from Cape Bathurst, and the furred animals seemed quite unconscious of its presence. Nor did the colonists notice it much, absorbed as they were in the contemplation of the approaching doom, which had broken down all the ordinary distinctions of race. A little before noon a sudden hope, too soon to end in disappointment, revived the drooping spirits of the colonists. Sabine, who had been standing for some time on the highest part of the islet looking at the sea, suddenly cried, "A boat! A boat!" It was as if an electric shock had suddenly ran through the group, for all started up and rushed towards the hunter. The Lieutenant looked at him inquiringly, and the man pointed to a white vapour on the horizon. Not a word was spoken, but all watched in breathless silence as the form of a vessel gradually rose against the sky. It was indeed a ship, and most likely a whaler. There was no doubt about it, and at the end of an hour even the keel was visible. Unfortunately this vessel appeared on the east of the islet, that is to say, on the opposite side to that from which the raft had drifted, so that there could be no hope that it was coming to their rescue after meeting with the raft, which would have suggested the fact of fellow creatures being in danger. The question was now, would those in the vessel perceive the islet? Would they be able to make out signals on it? Alas! in broad daylight, with a bright sun shining, it was not likely they would. Had it been night, some of the planks of the remaining shed might have made a fire large enough to be seen at a considerable distance, but the boat would probably have disappeared before the darkness set in, and although it seemed of little use, signals were made, and guns fired on the islet. The vessel was certainly approaching, and seemed to be a large three-master, evidently a whaler from New Archangel, which was on its way to Behring Strait after having doubled the peninsula of Alaska. It was to the windward of the islet, and tacking to starboard with its lower sails, topsails, and topgallant sails all set. It was steadily advancing to the north. A sailor would have seen at a glance that it was not bearing towards the islet, but it might even yet perceive it, and alter its course. "If it does see us," whispered Hobson in Long's ear, "it is more likely to avoid us than to come nearer." The Lieutenant was right, for there is nothing vessels dread more in these latitudes than the approach of icebergs and ice floes. They look upon them as floating rocks, against which there is a danger of striking, especially in the night, and they therefore hasten to change their course when ice is sighted, and this vessel would most likely do the same, if it noticed the islet at all. The alternations of hope and despair through which the anxious watchers passed may be imagined, but cannot be described. Until 2 o'clock in the afternoon they were able to believe that Heaven had at last taken pity on them, that help was coming, that their safety was assured. The vessel continued to approach in an oblique direction, and was presently not more than 6 miles from the islet. Signal after signal was tried, gun after gun fired, and some of the planks of the shed were burnt. All in vain; either they were not seen, or the vessel was anxious to avoid the islet. At half past 2 it luffed slightly, and bore away to the northeast. In another hour a white vapour was all that was visible, and that soon disappeared. On this the soldier Kellet burst into a roar of hysterical laughter, and flinging himself on the ground, rolled over and over like a madman. Mrs Barnett turned and looked Madge full in the face, as if to ask her if she still hoped, and Madge turned away her head. On this same ill-fated day a crackling noise was heard, and the greater part of the islet broke off and plunged into the sea. The cries of the drowning animals rent the air, and the islet was reduced to the narrow strip between the site of the engulfed house and Cape Bathurst. It was now merely a piece of ice. Chapter 22. Part 2, Chapter 23 of The Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 23. On a Piece of Ice. A piece of ice, a jagged, triangular strip of ice, measuring 100 feet at its base, and scarcely 500 in its greatest extent, and on it 21 human beings, some 100 furred animals, a few dogs, and a large bear, which was at this moment crouching at the very edge. Yes, all the luckless colonists were there. Not one had yet been swallowed up. The last rupture had occurred when they were all in the shed. Thus far fate had spared them, probably that they might all perish together. A silent, sleepless night ensued. No one spoke or moved, for the slightest shake or blow might suffice to break the ice. No one would touch the salt meat served round by Mrs Joliffe. What would be the good of eating? Nearly every one remained in the open air, feeling that it would be better to be drowned in the open sea than in a narrow wooden shed. The next day, June 5th, the sun shone brightly down upon the heads of the doomed band of wanderers. All were still silent, and seemed anxious to avoid each other. Many gazed with troubled, anxious eyes at the perfect circle of the horizon, of which the miserable little strip of ice formed the centre. But the sea was absolutely deserted. Not a sail, not an ice floe, not an islet. Their own piece of ice was probably the very last floating on the Behring Sea. The temperature continued to rise, the wind had gone down, and a terrible calm had set in. A gentle swell heaved the surface of the sea, and the morsel of earth and ice, which was all that was left of Victoria Island, rose and sank without change of position, like a wreck. And what was it but a wreck? But a wreck, a piece of woodwork, a broken mast, or a few planks remain floating. They offer some resistance to the waves, they will not melt. But this piece of ice, this solidified water, must dissolve with the heat of the sun. This piece of ice had formed the thickest part of the island, and this will explain its having lasted so long. A layer of earth and plenty of vegetation covered it, and the base of ice must have been of considerable thickness. The long, bitter polar winters must have fed it with fresh ice, in countless centuries during which it was connected with the mainland. Even now its mean height was 5 or 6 feet above the sea level, and its base was probably of about the same thickness. Although in these quiet waters it was not likely to be broken, it could not fail gradually to melt, and the rapid dissolution could actually be watched at the edges, for as the long waves licked the sides, piece after piece of ground with its verdant covering sank to rise no more. On this 5th June a fall of this nature occurred at about 1 o'clock P.M. on the site of the shed itself, which was very near the edge of the ice. There was fortunately no one in it at the time, and all that was saved was a few planks, and 2 or 3 of the timbers of the roofs. Most of the cooking utensils and all the astronomical instruments were lost. The colonists were now obliged to take refuge on the highest part of the islet, where nothing protected them from the weather. But fortunately a few tools had been left there, with the air pumps and the air vessel, which Hobson had employed for catching a little of the rain water for drinking purposes, as he no longer dared to draw for a supply upon the ice, every atom of which was of value. At about 4 o'clock P.M. the soldier Kellet, the same who had already given signs of insanity, came to Mrs Barnett and said quietly— "I am going to drown myself, ma'am." "What, Kellet?" exclaimed the lady. "I tell you I am going to drown myself," replied the soldier. "I have thought the matter well over. There is no escape for us, and I prefer dying at once to waiting to be killed." "Kellet!" said Mrs Barnett, taking the man's hand and looking into his face, which was strangely composed, "you will not do that?" "Yes, I will, ma'am. And as you have always been very good to us all, I wanted to wish you good bye. Good bye, ma'am." And Kellet turned towards the sea. Mrs Barnett, terrified at his manner, threw herself upon him and held him back. Her cries brought Hobson and Long to her assistance, and they did all in their power to dissuade the unhappy man from carrying out his purpose, but he was not to be moved, and merely shook his head. His mind was evidently disordered, and it was useless to reason with him. It was a terrible moment, as his example might lead some of his comrades to commit suicide also. At all hazards he must be prevented from doing as he threatened. "Kellet," said Mrs Barnett gently, with half a smile, "we have always been very good friends, have we not?" "Yes, ma'am," replied Kellet calmly. "Well, Kellet, if you like we will die together, but not to-day." "What, ma'am?" "No, my brave fellow, I am not ready, but to-morrow if you like." The soldier looked more fixedly than ever at the courageous woman, and seemed to hesitate an instant. Then he cast a glance of fierce longing at the sea, and passing his hand over his eyes, said— "To-morrow." And without another word he quietly turned away and went back to his comrades. "Poor fellow!" murmured Mrs Barnett. "I have asked him to wait till to-morrow, and who can say whether we shall not all be drowned by that time?" Throughout that night Hobson remained motionless upon the beach, pondering whether there might not yet be some means to check the dissolution of the islet, if it might not yet be possible to preserve it until they came in sight of land of some sort. Mrs Barnett and Madge did not leave each other for an instant. Kalumah crouched like a dog at the feet of her mistress, and tried to keep her warm. Mrs Mac Nab, wrapped in a few furs, the remains of the rich stores of Fort Hope, had fallen into a kind of torpor, with her baby clasped in her arms. The stars shone with extraordinary brilliancy, and no sounds broke the stillness of the night but the rippling of the waves and the splash of the pieces of ice as they fell into the sea. The colonists, stretched upon the ground in scattered groups, were as motionless as corpses on an abandoned wreck. Sometimes Sergeant Long rose and peered into the night mists, but seeing nothing, he resumed his horizontal position. The bear, looking like a great white snowball, cowered motionless at the very edge of the strip of ice. This night also passed away without any incident to modify the situation. The grey morning dawned in the east, and the sun rose and dispersed the shadows of the night. The Lieutenant's first care, as soon as it was light, was to examine the piece of ice. Its perimeter was still more reduced, and alas, its mean height above the sea level had sensibly diminished. The waves, quiet as they were, washed over the greater part of it. The summit of the little hill alone was still beyond their reach. Long, too, saw the changes which had taken place during the night, and felt that all hope was gone. Mrs Barnett joined Lieutenant Hobson, and said to him— "It will be to-day, then?" "Yes, madam, and you will keep your promise to Calais." "Lieutenant Hobson," said the lady solemnly, "have we done all in our power?" "We have, madam." "Then God's will be done." One last attempt was, however, made during the day. A strong breeze set in from the offing, that is to say, a wind bearing to the southeast, the direction in which were situated the nearest of the Aleutian Islands. How far off no one could say, as without instruments the bearings of the island could not be taken. It was not likely to have drifted far, however, unless under the influence of the current, as it gave no hold to the wind. Still, it was just possible that they might be nearer land than they thought. If only a current, the direction of which it was impossible to ascertain, had taken them nearer to the much longed for Aleutian Islands, then, as the wind was bearing down upon those very islands, it might drive the strip of ice before it if a sail of some kind could be concocted. The ice had still several hours to float, and in several hours the land might come in sight, or if not the land, some coasting or fishing vessel. A forlorn hope truly, but it suggested an idea to the Lieutenant which he resolved to carry out. Could not a sail be contrived on the island as on an ordinary raft? There could be no difficulty in that, and when Hobson suggested it to Mac Nab, he exclaimed— "You are quite right, sir," adding to his men, "bring out all the canvas there is." Every one was quite revived by this plan, slight as was the chance it afforded, and all lent a helping hand, even Calais, who had not yet reminded Mrs Barnett of her promise. A beam, which had once formed part of the roof of the barracks, was sunk deep into the earth and sand of which the little hill was composed, and firmly fixed with ropes arranged like shrouds and a stay. A sail, made of all the cloths and coverlets still remaining, fastened on to a strong pole for a yard, was hoisted on the mast. This sail, or rather collection of sails, suitably set, swelled in the breeze, and by the wake it left it was evident that the strip of ice was rapidly moving towards the southeast. It was a success, and every one was cheered with newly awakened hope. They were no longer stationary, they were advancing, slowly it was true, but still they were advancing. The carpenter was particularly elated. All eagerly scanned the horizon, and had they been told that no land could be sighted, they would have refused to believe it. So it appeared, however, for the strip of ice floated along the waves for 3 hours in the centre of an absolutely circular and unbroken horizon. The poor colonists still hoped on. Towards 3 o'clock the Lieutenant took the Sergeant aside and said to him— "We are advancing at the cost of the solidity and duration of our islet." "What do you mean, sir?" "I mean that the ice is being rapidly fretted away as it moves along. Its speed is hastening its dissolution, and since we set sail it has diminished one third." "Are you quite sure?" "Absolutely certain. The ice is longer and flatter. Look, the sea is not more than 10 feet from the hill." It was true, and the result was what might naturally have been expected from the motion of the ice. "Sergeant," resumed Hobson, "do you think we ought to take down our sail?" "I think," replied Long, after a moment's reflection, "that we should consult our comrades. We ought all to share the responsibility of a decision now." The Lieutenant bent his head in assent, and the two returned to their old position on the little hill. Hobson put the case before the whole party. "The speed we have given to the ice," he said, "is causing it to wear away rapidly, and will perhaps hasten the inevitable catastrophe by a few hours. My friends, you must decide whether we shall still go on." "Forwards!" all cried with one voice. So it was decided, and, as it turned out, the decision was fraught with consequences of incalculable importance. At 6 o'clock P.M. Madge rose, and, pointing to a point on the south east, cried "Land!" Every one started up as if struck by lightning. Land there was indeed on the south east, 12 miles from the island. "More sail! more sail!" shouted Hobson. He was understood, and fresh materials were hastily brought. On the shrouds a sort of studding sail was rigged up of clothes, furs, everything, in short, that could give hold to the wind. The speed increased as the wind freshened, but the ice was melting everywhere. It trembled beneath the feet of the anxious watchers, and might open at any moment. But they would not think of that. They were buoyed up with hope. Safety was at hand on the land they were rapidly nearing. They shouted, they made signals, they were in a delirium of excitement. At half past 7 the ice was much nearer the land, but it was visibly melting, and sinking rapidly. Water was gushing from it, and the waves were washing over it, sweeping off the terrified quadrupeds before the eyes of the colonists. Every instant they expected the whole mass to be engulfed, and it was necessary to lighten it like a sinking vessel. Every means was tried to check the dissolution. The earth and sand were carefully spread about, especially at the edges of the ice, to protect it from the direct influence of the sunbeams, and furs were laid here and there, as being bad conductors of heat. But it was of no avail. The lower portion of the ice began to crack, and several fissures opened in the surface. It was now but a question of moments. Night set in, and there was nothing left for the poor colonists to do to quicken the speed of the islet. Some of them tried to paddle about on planks. The coast was still 4 miles to windward. It was a dark gloomy night without any moon, and Hobson, whose heroic courage did not even now fail him, shouted— "A signal, my friends, a signal!" A pile was made of all the remaining combustibles, 2 or 3 planks and a beam. It was set fire to, and bright flames soon shot up, but the strip of ice continued to melt and sink. Presently the little hill alone remained above the water, and on it the despairing wretches, with a few animals left alive, huddled together, the bear growling fiercely. The water was still rising, and there was no sign that any one on land had seen the signal. In less than a quarter of an hour they must all be swallowed up. Could nothing be done to make the ice last longer? In 3 hours, 3 short hours, they might reach the land, which was now but 3 miles to windward. "Oh!" cried Hobson, "if only I could stop the ice from melting, I would give my life to know how. Yes, I would give my life." "There is one way," suddenly replied a voice. It was Thomas Black who spoke, the astronomer who had not opened his lips for so long, and who had long since appeared dead to all that was going on. "Yes," he continued, "there is one way of checking the dissolution of the ice. There is one way of saving us all." All gathered eagerly round the speaker, and looked at him inquiringly. They thought he must have misheard what he had said. "Well?" asked Hobson, "what way do you mean?" "To the pumps," replied Black simply. Was he mad? Did he take the ice for a sinking vessel with 10 feet of water in the hold? The air pumps were at hand, together with the air vessel, which Hobson had been using as a reservoir for drinking water. But of what use could they be? Could they harden the ice which was melting all over? "He is mad!" exclaimed Long. "To the pumps!" repeated the astronomer. "Fill the reservoir with air." "Do as he tells you!" cried Mrs Barnett. The pumps were attached to the reservoir, the cover of which was closed and bolted. The pumps were at once set to work. The air was condensed under the pressure of several atmospheres. Then Black, taking one of the leather pipes connected with the reservoir, and opening the cock, let the condensed air escape, walking round the ice wherever it was melting. Every one was astonished at the effect produced. Wherever the air was projected by the astronomer, the fissures filled up, and the surface refrozen. "Hurrah! hurrah!" shouted all with one voice. It was tiring enough to work the pumps, but there were plenty of volunteers. The edges of the ice were again solidified, as if under the influence of intense cold. "You have saved us, Mr Black," said Lieutenant Hobson. "Nothing could be more natural," replied the astronomer quietly. Nothing, in fact, could have been more natural, and the physical effort produced may be described as follows. There were two reasons for the relegation. First, under the pressure of the air, the water vaporized on the surface of the ice produced intense cold, and the compressed air in expanding abstracted the heat from the thawed surface, which immediately refroze. Wherever the ice was opening, the cold cemented the edges, so that it gradually regained its original solidity. This went on for several hours, and the colonists, buoyed up by hope, toiled on with unwearying zeal. They were nearing the coast, and when they were about a quarter of a mile from it, the Bear plunged into the sea, and swimming to the shore, soon disappeared. A few minutes afterwards the ice ran aground upon a beach, and the few animals still upon it hurried away in the darkness. The colonists disembarked, and falling on their knees, returned thanks to God for their miraculous deliverance. Chapter 24. Of the Fur Country. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fur Country by Jules Verne. Chapter 24. Conclusion. It was on the island of Blejinie, the last of the Aleutian group, at the extreme south of Behring Sea, that all the colonists of Fort Hope had at last landed, after having traversed 1800 miles since the breaking up of the ice. They were hospitably received by some Aleutian fishermen who had hurried to their assistance, and were soon able to communicate with some English agents of the Hudson's Bay Company. After all the details we have given, it is needless to dwell on the courage and energy of the brave little band, which had proved itself worthy of its noble leader. We know how all struggled with their misfortunes, and how patiently they had submitted to the will of God. We have seen Mrs Barnett cheering every one by her example and sympathy, and we know that neither she nor those with her yielded to despair when the peninsula on which Fort Hope had been built was converted into a wandering island, when that island became an islet, and the islet a strip of ice, or even when that strip of ice was melting beneath the combined influence of sun and waves. If the scheme of the Company was a failure, if the new fort had perished, no one could possibly blame Hobson or his companions, who had gone through such extraordinary and unexpected trials. Of the 19 persons under the Lieutenant's charge, not one was missing, and he had even 2 new members in his little colony, Kalumah and Mrs Barnett's godson, Michael Mac Nab. 6 days after their rescue, the shipwrecked mariners arrived at New Archangel, the capital of Russian America. Here the friends, bound together by so many dangers shared, must part, probably for ever. Hobson and his men were to return to Fort Reliance across English America, whilst Mrs Barnett, accompanied by Kalumah, who would not leave her, Madge, and Thomas Black, intended to go back to Europe via San Francisco and the United States. But whilst they were still all together, the Lieutenant, addressing Mrs Barnett, said with considerable emotion— "God bless you, madam, for all you have been to us. You have been our comforter, our consoler, the very soul of our little world, and I thank you in the name of all." 3 cheers for Mrs Barnett greeted this speech, and each soldier begged to shake her by the hand, whilst the women embraced her affectionately. The Lieutenant himself had conceived so warm an affection for the lady who had so long been his friend and counsellor, that he could not bid her good bye without great emotion. "Can it be that we shall never meet again?" he exclaimed. "No, Lieutenant," replied Mrs Barnett. We shall meet again. If you do not come and see me in Europe, I will come back to you at Fort Reliance, or to the new factory you will found some day yet." On hearing this, Thomas Black, who had regained the use of his tongue since he had landed on terra firma, came forward and said, with an air of the greatest conviction— "Yes, we shall meet again in 36 years. My friends, I miss the eclipse of 1860, but I will not miss that which will take place under exactly similar conditions in the same latitudes in 1896, and therefore I appoint a meeting with you, Lieutenant, and with you, my dear madam, on the confines of the Arctic Ocean 36 years hence." CHAPTER 24. End of Part 2. End of the Fur Country by Jules Verne.